Hello, welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework tutorial series. My name is Juvonen. I'm a product manager in the Microsoft 365 platform side of the house. Now, in this video, we'll have a look on how do you build your first SharePoint Framework client-side web part. So this is the first part of creating a web part. Then on the second part, we'll a bit modify that code. In the third part, we'll actually test the code and deploy that to be available in the well, I don't think it's a third, fourth, I don't know. But we'll have a 3 different tutorial series to walk through the steps of creating the web part, modifying the code, adjusting the code, and testing the code, and then deploying that code to the SharePoint Online. Now, this video has been recorded in April 2022, and it's using a SharePoint Framework 1.14 version. If you are using a newer version, there might be some adjustments here and there. So please always double check the written tutorial for the latest guidance and latest insights. These videos are not as frequently updated as the written tutorial. Now, let's actually get to it. So let's jump on the Windows 10 machine. Now, let's actually start by opening up our command line. Again, it could be any command line tooling what you want. I just had the Windows PowerShell available from the toolbar for whatever reason, and I'll use that one. So let's actually go to the root of the machine. Let me actually double check what's available. Nothing is available, so let me actually create a new folder called code. And I'm going to actually move into that folder, so cd code. It's for sure up to you whether I want to put the code and the projects, but we want to move to the folder where you will be creating the first SharePoint Framework project. Now, in that folder, in command line, we're going to use yo Microsoft SharePoint, and that's going to start the SharePoint Framework scaffolding process or the YOMA generator for SharePoint Framework. So it's going to start asking us questions. A few things to note here as we're running the code, depending again on the which tool you're using. It's really hard to see with that background color, but we can see that it's 1.14.0 version, which I'm using in here. Now I'm actually in the code folder, which wasn't my intention. So let's actually go break this. I'm going to do Control-C, and let's actually create a new project here, which is called web part, because we are creating a web part, and let me go to that web part folder. Here we go, and then I'm going to do cleanup, and then I'm going to execute the yo Microsoft SharePoint. There we go, starting the YOMA generator, the SharePoint Framework YOMA generator, which is asking then the questions related on what do we want to set this, the options. So what is our solution name? Let's actually call this my first web part. This will be actually then also used as the solution package name. Again, depending on what you want, but please remember that, or well, actually you see it in the output. So, but the tooling, the documentation might be a bit different depending on, again, what is the names and terms you're using as you're selecting things. Now, we want to create our first web part, and so we're going to choose web part from the selection from arrows. You would be able to then choose something else. I'm going to choose web part, press enter. We're going to use it as a HelloWorld. So we will find it as a HelloWorld in the web part picker. And in this case, we're going to use the no framework option. So there's 3 different template options available. Minimal is quite minimal. So it's only the bare bones of the needed code for a web part. No framework means that there's no JavaScript framework associated to the templates by default. And then the React means that it's based on React implementation. You could absolutely choose no framework and then start using Angular or Vue.js or Amber or whatever is your preference as the framework. So there's no limitations on that on SharePoint Framework. So I'm going to use now the no framework, and that's going to start the scaffolding process. Now, this again takes a while depending on the machine and depending on the network connectivity. What's happening here is that the project is now downloading the needed dependencies from the internet to make the TypeScript, the modern web stack development project, to work properly within this machine. So that's going to take a while. So let's speed up the video until we are ready to go. And there we go. Now we have scaffolded the first SharePoint Framework solution with a web part option. Now, I want to actually call out here, we can see some vulnerabilities, which are low, moderate, high, and critical. We are, of course, all the time following on these things and making sure that they're not a critical things in runtime when the web parts are being used. Now, there are some of these web parts, some of these packages are being used on development time. Some of those packages are being used on server side. If you would be having server-side code, and then only a subset of these packages and only a subset of these concerns might be relevant for client-side runtime code. And of course, from Microsoft side, we are following up on when that's the case, and then we're updating the packages as needed. So even though we see now here 3 critical options, it does not mean that it's a 3 critical options for the client-side runtime development or usage of SharePoint Framework solution. That's not what that means. But I understand that it might look a bit horrifying with the first impressions. Now, before we actually go to the code and have a look on the solution structure, there's one thing which we asked people to do before they start debugging and testing the code, which is we execute gulp serve. Oh, no. Gulp trust dev. Trust dev assert. So I'm going to execute this command. This command has to be executed in a project structure, because then what happens behind of the scenes is that the gulp is task manager. The task manager is starting the required actions to install the developer certificate on this machine. And depending on have you installed that before on this machine or not, this might be a bit of a different kind of a execution. In my case, I didn't get the prompt in this case because I have previously already executed this command on this machine, and there's no harm for doing that multiple times. It's needed so that whenever we are referencing the local host from SharePoint Online, there will not be a violation between HTTP and HTTPS, and the browser is able to load the development time assets from local host. So that's why this certificate is needed. So we're installing a HTTPS access points or certificate for the code which we're hosting at localhost. So that's a one-time execution per machine, and we no longer have to worry about that one within this particular machine when we're creating the projects. But again, if you're having problems, you can execute that for sure multiple times. There's no concerns on that. And now we can actually then open up the code and have a look on how the structure and the project structure and the solution structure looks like in Visual Studio Code. You can for sure use whatever is your preferred tooling. Again, we're using Visual Studio Code in this case, but it's not necessarily always the chosen tool, depending on your preference. And all of the SharePoint Framework solutions, they look exactly the same. So basically, the only main difference is that how many web parts and how many config pieces of code and code files we actually have in the source folder. But basic structure of SharePoint Framework code, SharePoint Framework solution is always the same. So we can find the YoRC in the root. We can always find what version was actually being used when the YAML generator was executing. We also give you a default README file, which is a good starting point for providing insights on your solution. Please remember to update this one so that the other people can understand what your solution is doing. Of course, there's the package.json file that's typical on the web stack development tooling. But more importantly, we have in the config folder, we have package solution.json, and this is basically defining what is your solution packaging model. And that means that one solution package can contain multiple web parts and other components as well. And this will be then the name of the solution, title of the solution, all of the additional settings can be controlled from this particular JSON file. So whenever we are ready to go and package our solution as a one unified, technically a zip file, we can actually do that. And then this JSON file defines what are the steps and guidance of how to do that. There are certain settings which we'll go through together within the following videos. Now, before we actually start testing, or if we would like to test this web part on what we actually got, we need to do one update in here. So we need to make sure that we are associating this project to your tenant. So the tenant which we already have prepared for development. So let's actually do that. Let's go and update the right URL in this location in surf.json files. So I'm going to go to my primary profile. I'm going to then jump to my developer profile, which is my development environment. And in here, I'll just go to the site. Well, actually, that went really fast. So I actually went to the developer site and dev site, which was the one which we created in the previous tutorial. Technically, any site is suitable for using the online workbench. And then as we keep on doing testing, as we do testing of functionalities, we use this site. So for example, when we are accessing the list of lists in the site, later on in this tutorial series, we will see these lists or libraries being listed. So we're executing the code in the context of this site collection, context of that site collection, which is before the underscore layouts and 15 and workbench. So that's the online workbench is the latter part of this URL in here. And I'll show you what that means in a second. But let me update the right site collection and the context. Not like that. Let me go back on the browser. I clearly missed it. And there's the right URL. And let me go back in the JSON file, updating that one. And now we are pointing to that site collection. And then underscore layouts and workbench is the online workbench where we can actually see our code. And we are loading the code dynamically from localhost, even though it's not yet deployed to the tenant, which is really, really cool. So let me actually save the changes. We are good to go. And then follow up on the tutorial. So that's been now updated. And then we can actually execute in the command line the following commands. Now, matter of a preference, whenever the project has been actually scaffolded, personally, I actually use always the runtime terminal in the Visual Studio Code, but it's matter of a preference. You can actually get the tutorial to be visible from the view folder. I clicked Control and the icon, so I could actually get it visible as a quick access as well. Matter of a preference. How do you want to do this? Do you want to run the command line from the PowerShell or a separate command line, or do you use the in Visual Studio Code terminal? But let's actually use this, and let me do culp serve. And let's see what actually happens. Dun, 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 dun. So culp serve now prepares the code, and then it fires that URL which we had configured in the Visual Studio Code in the context. Now, what we also did here is that there's actually, we are a bit faster than expected. So we are already loading this in the URL in the right profile, but we can actually see from here that it was still taking some time on the Webpack processing. So we're still waiting for the things to complete fully, and that's why we actually see this warning, which says your web part will not appear in the toolbox. Please make sure the culp serve is running in the web part project. Please refresh the page when the culp serve is running. Now, let's click OK, and let's do one more refresh on the same page, and voila, that warning is gone. So now, if I go in here, we can actually see that there was a request on the temp and manifest JSON, and that's basically the request which is coming from browser localhost to expose our web part in the web part picker. So now if I go here, click the web part picker, we can actually see the local group, and we can see the HelloWorld in here. Let me click that one, and voila, we are actually having our first web part running in SharePoint Online in the context of the workbench, in the context of the site where we are, which we created. And from here, we can see things like it's already detected who I am. It's also saying something interesting, which is web part property value hello world. So what does that actually mean? Now, if I take the web part and I edit the web part, we can actually see the web part properties. So we can see right now the default properties, we haven't updated any of this stuff. All of this is editable, and we can see the one property which is the hello world in here. Now, these properties are of course editable, so I can update this any way I want, and more importantly, you can actually see the updates being visible directly in the web part. So there's two different options. Your web part can be reactive or non-reactive, and if it's this kind of a dynamic, which means reactive, all of the updates are being immediately applied on the web part side. It can be also the web part setting can be set to be in a way that you first want to have a configuration complete and click apply, and then that actually applies the adjusted changes. It is up to the designer or the web part developer how it should be working. Good, that is our first web part, and it's now live. We can see it in there, and nicely it actually welcomed me as a developer to access information. There's references to the documentation. If you need to access, for example, SharePoint Framework API reference, there's a lot of different opportunities there, and you can access that from here as well. And there are hundreds of existing examples already available for SharePoint Framework through our Microsoft 365 platform community. Now, let me actually go back in the Visual Studio Code. Let me do Control C. So I'm going to break the execution and serve, and we're going to do some adjustments in the code. So let me actually go to the source code file of the web part, open up the web part source code. Let me minimize the terminal so we have a bit more space, and we can see how this has been created. So first of all, we do give you a baseline of structures and baseline of things, and there's a lot of libraries and options available. By default, we'll give you an interface or a property model with a description, and this was the one which we modified in the property pane. So we basically had a modification there. And then there's additional set of settings, like for example environmental message, and this is am I online or am I in local. That's actually the render element. So we're saying that this web part in its inner HTML, we will inject this HTML, and that's actually the one which is making things visible as part of the UX. Obviously, that's the most kind of critical piece of the information. Now, in here, we can also see the properties description, which is part of our properties back in here. And that's the one which is being exposed in the property pane. So we're able to configure that, and then we're escaping that out as a string in the web part UX. We can modify, there's different set of properties which we can use. So let's actually do that following up on the tutorial. So let's a bit modify this code. I'm going to go all the way up in here where we are introducing property pane configuration and the property pane text field. I'm going to add here a few more items. Then I'm going to go Alt, Shift, and F. Oop, wrong button. Alt, Shift, and F. No, Alt, Shift, and F. There we go. Now it's actually formatting that nicely, so I didn't have to format that manually. Alt, Shift, and F within the Windows machine. That's Visual Studio Code adjustments. So now we're adding those additional boxes and property pane controls to be available. We want to modify a bit our settings. So we want to have a few more properties available for the web part. So let's actually adjust that setting a bit. So let me actually come in here and update that with a test 1, test 2, test 3. So we can see different kind of property pane adjustments and options pretty soon as we deploy the new version of the code. And then all the way down, if I scroll here, we can see the current get property pane configuration implementation. And this one was basically defining that this kind of a control property pane text field will be exposed in the property pane of the web part whenever the web part is being in edit mode. So this is the one which we want to now a bit modify. I will copy the code directly from the tutorial and replacing that one with a bit more complex settings. So what we're doing here is that we're saying that we're exposing property description, test 1, test 2, with the specific set of controls with the specific text. So we can, this way we can then modify what will be exposed in the property pane. So as an example, the property, so the test number 3, let me go all the way back in here, is a Boolean. So therefore we can expose that's true or false. So we can easily use that to be having a property pane toggle, which is then with the label toggle and on text on and off, and then that's true or false as the outcome. That's quite simple and really easy to then adjust the additional settings. Now, let's go back in the code and adjust that section a bit. Where do we have that section? Property web part property pane value. And let's actually, in here, I'm going to paste in those additional properties. And let me actually adjust this a bit. There we go. So because we're in inline HTML, I cannot do the Alt-Shift-F to do the quick formatting on those. So that's now fine. One more thing what we want to do is that we want to explicitly say for the web part, and this is the web part manifest. So every single SharePoint Framework component has its own manifest, which defines what it is, how does it behave, how does it actually is being exposed. For example, for web parts, we can say that the web part is a SharePoint web part, or it will be exposed as a Teams personal app, when it's not really a web part anymore, which is a bit of a confusing thing, or it can be exposed as a Teams tabs or a SharePoint full page, but the base class is still the same. So we are able to control where the web part is being visible and what are the options, and also what is the title of the web part, or what is the icon of the web part, and what is the properties and descriptions. Now, as we introduce a few set of new properties, we want to actually update that properties section a bit. So let me do that. Let me update those additional tests, test 1, test 2, then test 3, and we're setting a default values for those properties. So technically, this is for adding the default values whenever the web part is getting added on the page. What are the default values for the properties which we defined in the web part property interface, which is in here. Good, that's pretty much it now. So let's actually go again, start our terminal. And I'm going to do another one. I'm double checking that I'm saved all of my changes. It's quite typical problem which I have. So I forget about saving, and then I'm wondering always why my changes are not visible. Well, wonder why. So let me do gulp serve, not server. That is a quite typical mistake for me as well. So gulp serve. And that's going to then start the browser again. It's going to recompile the code. It's going to adjust the code, and then it's going to fire again the browser. But I was actually quick enough. Well, actually, let's go in here. I'm just want to double check that there are no exceptions. So we can actually see that things are loading properly. Started serving from local host. Looks okay. So this is really, really good. And now let's actually go back in the browser. And let me go here underneath the local or frequently used, because it is detecting that we used it already. We can check the web part to be available. And we seem to have a bit of a challenge here, which is actually the default values of the properties. Now, let me explain actually what happened here and how to fix that. Now, we do have the new properties already available and visible, and the more complex property pane in the property pane. So we did say that we have a few additional fields, and we can actually set them. We can see how the fields are getting set. But the challenge which we had was the missing default values as we added the web part on the page. And the reason why that happened was that we didn't actually recompile or reset the default files in the temp folder when we started serving the files. So there was basically just a miss of timing and the resetting the files which are ready for distribution in the distribution folder. Now, I know for a fact that the default values will work, but let's actually double check that one more time, even though a bit of the script of the tutorial, but that's fine. This is why to solve this would be to do gulp bundle, which will then rebundle the TypeScript and transform the TypeScript to be JavaScript. It's basically getting all of the assets and components and everything, resetting those to be available in the temporary folder. Doesn't take too long. There we go. Now we're good to go. And now if I do gulp serve, we have a new set of bundle. We have a new set of files. We will refresh the situation. And as we now start the online workbench and add the web part to be available, crossing fingers, we do have a default set of properties and default set of property values available for those properties. And now if I open up the property pane, we can see that the default settings are available. And now if I adjust any of these and close the property pane, they are updated on the page. So we're basically in a normal status like it should be. So that was just a timing thing as why the web part properties and the default values were not available. And how did we fix that? Was running the gulp bundle. So we did execute or rebundled the whole package and then we execute it again, gulp serve, and then we are serving the updated packages from the temporary location for now, because we're still doing local debugging from the local machine. But that's all we're going to do in this tutorial. So basically what we have done now is that we created our baseline web part, our very first web part, and we're doing development from from local host. And then next what we're going to do is that we're adding a bit of piece of code to the web part, so getting it connected to the SharePoint Online API surface, and then we kind of deploy that to the SharePoint and test that it's actually working in SharePoint Online.